Hello, everybody, and welcome. Let's go ahead and get started. Everybody's in the right place. This is the ModelPort webinar. ModelPort is a plugin to ArchiCAD. We're going to be talking about how to work with SketchUp models that you import into ArchiCAD. So here's the agenda. And before I get into that, let me first introduce myself. So my name is Tom Simmons. I am the Business Director and BIM Consultant here at ArchVista Consulting. We're going to go through a couple different topics today. We're going to start with a kind of review and overview of sort of ArchiCAD's default object import process. We're then going to step into talking about how you import and edit objects with ModelPort. We'll then review how to improve 2D and 3D graphics. And finally, we'll conclude with a discussion about how to manage these models when you brought them in terms of file size and polygon count. At the end of the presentation, we will take questions and answers. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, feel free to go and enter that into the control panel. If it's on your mind, you don't need to wait till the end. Go ahead and enter that into the control panel, and then I will take that and review that at that point. Of course, if you also have questions at the end of the presentation, you can just wait and enter those in at that time as well. So let's start by a review of the default process when you import objects into ArchiCAD. So for those of you here who use ArchiCAD, I'm assuming that probably everyone here does use ArchiCAD. You've probably had instances where you've had to import objects from manufacturers, from the 3D warehouse, from any number of different sources out there that makes an SKP or SketchUp object format available. Now, other format here you'll see here is called a Collada DAE. I put that on there because if you've ever imported, or excuse me, downloaded an object from 3D Warehouse, and there's other resources out there as well that offer this format, but on the 3D Warehouse, Collada DAE is a universal format that is offered in addition to the standard SketchUp SKP format. So oftentimes users will try out both formats to see which one's going to work better. But what I'm going to discuss here basically is relevant to both. And that is when you import either of these formats, you're going to have limited parametric editing. You're going to have no material editing. And there's going to be no preview image. And then the other problem that quite often is the case too is that if you have any sort of object like this chair that has curves to it, that will also create problems because those curves in ArchiCAD are created by polygons. Polygons are basically triangles that are connected together, and the finer those polygons are, the smoother that curve will be. But it also means there's an increased number of polygons as well, the more high definition curves that we have. And this can really affect performance because the higher number of polygons, typically the decreased performance we might have within our model. So we have to be careful about those kinds of things and think about those kinds of things when we import objects from other sources. Now, a planar object like this particular one we see here, that we might download from the 3D warehouse or a manufacturer, these work pretty well. And what I mean by planar is that it's got a vertical surface, it's got a horizontal surface, it's got a slope surface, but they're just flat surfaces. And those surfaces, again, there's no triangulation going on, so they import well. They look good in 3D. The symbol looks good. That's all great. The issue becomes when we import objects that have curved surfaces in it. And it could be that you have an object like this that looks pretty good, except for the sink and the tap. And you can see here where the curves really have created a problem in creating this heavy triangulation. And so, this is something we have to deal with anytime we have objects that have curves in them. Now, one of the things that we can do to try to solve that sometimes is we can convert these objects into morphs. And this is what people will often do within ArchiCAD to try to see if they can solve that problem. And so you have to go through a lot of steps to do this. And you also, if it's an object that has a lot of polygons to it, if you convert it to a morph, it can be really slow, sluggish, and really decrease the performance of your models. You have to be careful with that. But if you do that, you can convert it. If you select it, you right-click it, you can select the option for convert selection to morph. and a little warning will come up, just warning you that if there's a large number of polygons, it could affect performance. And then you can select the individual meshes or morphs, edges and surfaces, and you can start to edit those, change the color, change the material, etc. But again, you never know when you go and convert it. Like I converted this to a morph, right, and all of a sudden lost the textures. So now you have to deal with that. So this is the kind of thing that happens. And then also you still have this kind of weird triangulation going on that can also create problems. So it's just, these types of issues that you run into when you have objects that come in from various sources. So what I'm going to try and take you through next is how ModelPort can help you manage a lot of these different issues you have and give you tools to not only manage the issues, but to edit the objects as well. So first, I want to talk a little bit about how ModelPort expands the access to objects. And that's basically by enabling you to have more 3D import options. So, in ArchiCAD's defaults, we've got, some of the defaults you can see here on the left. But ModelPort basically adds about 10 additional formats to those standard formats in ArchiCAD that you can access. And in addition to that, we just recently, in the last month, added a new direct SketchUp import format as well. And that's what I'll talk about today. I'll focus on that. But really what I'm talking about today also can be applied to any of these different other formats as well. But we're going to try and focus on the SketchUp direct inside ModelPort today. Now, when you import a object from ArchiCAD or ModelPort, I want to also make sure we understand the direct SketchUp import versus the import from ArchiCAD. So if I'm importing using the ArchiCAD import process, the default process in ArchiCAD, and I import that SketchUp object in, that's a direct SketchUp import, right? So I'm downloading that SketchUp 2022 model from the 3D warehouse. I'm opening ArchiCAD, I'm going interoperability, and I'm going and I'm bringing and merging that SketchUp object in that's going to convert that object into a ArchiCAD object that I can now use in my model. That's a direct SketchUp import default method you do in ArchiCAD. And within ArchiCAD 26, build 4022, which is the most recent build, you can now import SketchUp 2022 and older formats. That's something very new. In ArchiCAD 26 build 3011, which was released in the summer, and ArchiCAD 25, and any older formats of ArchiCAD, they were always back a couple versions from the most recent. So, for example, this summer we could access SketchUp 2019 model format and older model formats, but not 2022, 2021, or 2020. So, the most recent update to ArchiCAD now enables us to access the most recent format for SketchUp, which is great. On the ModelPort side, we've done the same thing. We now have a direct SketchUp import option as well that's been added in. And that direct import option for SketchUp will allow us also access that SketchUp 2022 model format and the older formats as well. There's a second option though in ModelPort, which I'll show you an example of in a few minutes. And that's an option called import from ArchiCAD. So before we had this direct SketchUp option in ModelPort, you would have to basically import your SketchUp model through the sort of default ArchiCAD import process, place it into the floor plan, select it, and then you could use the import from ArchiCAD option in ModelPort to bring it into ModelPort to further edit it. But now we can use the direct SketchUp. Now, with that said, that import from ArchiCAD option, which I'll show you in a minute, can be used in other ways in addition to importing older SketchUp model files. So another thing I want to clarify too is the different ways that both ModelPort and ArchiCAD work in terms of the way that they import a SketchUp model file. So with ArchiCAD, it basically is importing each polygon as separate elements. So as you can kind of see here on the left, with all these curved elements in this model, is that you end up with triangulations, and they're each individually shown, which is why it actually has a line for each individual part in both 2D and 3D, because that's just the way the ArchiCAD handles it when it imports it. When ModelPort imports it in, we actually go a step further. We take it and we actually join all the surfaces and connect them. And so what that does is it creates a much smoother 3D model element and a much better 2D element as well. So in terms of the symbols. So this is something we've tried to do in terms of our process with ModelPort to give you a much better result and better quality of the objects that you import. Now, in terms of how this works, both with Mac and Windows, for those of you who may be using ModelPort and want to take advantage of the new SketchUp plugin, or for those of you who are thinking about ModelPort and want to download the trial, if you're on the Windows side and you install ModelPort and you go to open up, or I should say import in a SketchUp file directly, you just go through this process. It's just straightforward. And you can do it both on the ArchiCAD side and the ModelPort side. And what I mean by that, let me clarify that, is that on the Windows side, I don't have to switch back and forth between the ArchiCAD loader and the ModelPort importer, etc. It all works simultaneously. And that's because Windows has an auto switch between the loaders, kind of part of the operating system, so that you don't have to make any sort of changes. On the Mac side, the OS, for whatever reason, doesn't auto switch between the ArchiCAD importer and the ModelPort loaders. So as a result, we actually have created ModelPort on the Mac side. So in the preferences, you can kind of see here in the red there in the middle, if you, right below that, there's two options. There's an ArchiCAD importer and a ModelPort loader. All that means is that when you first install ModelPort, it's going to automatically switch it over to the ModelPort loader, so that in the future, anytime you want to bring in a SketchUp object, you're going to bring it in through ModelPort, not through ArchiCAD, because you can't have the SketchUp and direct SketchUp plugin in ArchiCAD and the one for ModelPort running at the same time. They have to be one or the other. So when you select one, you simply restart ArchiCAD and it starts with that one. You select the other, again, restart it, and it starts with that. Just the way that it works on the Mac side. The Windows side has an auto switch, so it doesn't even, you don't need to worry about that. All right, so just so you guys know that, because that's important if you are on the Mac side. Again, it gets set up initially when you install, but after that, it runs pretty straightforward. Okay, another important part is the ArchiCAD and ModelPort support of the silicon technology with Apple. So if you don't know, ArchiCAD, or say Graphisoft, is getting ready to release the ArchiCAD silicon support here in the next couple weeks. And did some beta testing. I've actually got it on my machine. It works great. But they didn't actually release the GDL development kit for silicon support to the developers, us and others, until last week. So we are in fact right now working on the development of ModelPort for the silicon support, and so that will be out soon after they do their release. We're hoping a couple weeks after that. What we'd like to have for anybody who's running it on the Mac side, we would recommend that you use the Intel version, which is what I use right now on my computer, which runs great, of ArchiCAD with ModelPort, and use that until we're able to do the update, because otherwise ModelPort won't run in the silicon version of the ArchiCAD installation until we actually have it updated. So that's our recommendation for the next couple of weeks after Graphisoft releases that new update. Okay, let's get into ModelPort. Just kind of talk a little bit about how it works. So if you are importing and have imported in an object, one of the great things about ModelPort is you can preview these objects before you bring them into ArchiCAD. So as an example, I've got this cabinet. I've got a bunch of different cabinets, and I want to review them before I actually convert them into an ArchiCAD object. And this is the nice thing about ModelPort, is that I can preview these objects before I create them. In ArchiCAD, if I had a dozen objects I downloaded from manufacturer, I would have to spend time importing each one and reviewing each one, and then deleting the ones I don't want to use out of my embedded library because I can't view them until I've actually imported them into ArchiCAD. And in some cases, some of them may take several minutes to import in for each one, because some import faster than others, because some have more polygons than others, etc. So that can take a lot of time, both on the front end in terms of import and the back end in terms of having to manage it inside of ArchiCAD after you've imported. With ModelPort, I can preview them all beforehand. It takes no time to actually bring them into the preview window. In fact, a fraction of the time compared to ArchiCAD. So it's a much, much better way of previewing your objects. Another nice thing is that you can, both in the preview window when you're editing objects, even before you've created it, and of course after you've created and imported those objects, you can actually edit by material or edit by object. So here you see is the object option. It's a little blue cube there that the arrow's over. And just to the right of that are 4 little squares, and those are by material. And so we edit by object. That means it's like by the body or glass or by wheels. In other words, just by elements within the object. And so if we edit by material, what that would mean is that we're going to edit by, the color, by the texture, by whatever material that we want to edit by paint, right? And so if I select the interior, for example, I want to edit that material. I want to edit material for the screens, or the material for the body of the paint, or perhaps for the wheels themselves. So, this allows us then to edit by element or object or by material. Now, another thing that's often an issue as well, and I'm sure you guys have seen this, is you've opened up objects, and not every object is the same, right? Some authors, when they create it, they will save it perfectly when you open it. It works awesome. Others, they leave things on. Things are cluttered. They didn't think about other people using it. Good example here. This is downloaded from the 3D Warehouse, right? It's a nice object, but unfortunately, the person who authored this wanted to save this with the rendering of this lamp in the model. So we need to delete that, okay? So in ModelPort, it's pretty easy. You simply select the element, go right-click it there in the item list, and delete the element, and that's done. That's much easier than having to bring that into ArchiCAD, convert that to a morph, delete that element, resave the element as an object. In this case, we're very quickly doing that, and on top of it, I can, once I've updated it, we'll update the element, and then I can also update the preview image. So if I've deleted that element, obviously I want the preview image to be updated, and then I can that will then update the preview image in my ArchiCAD library. Now, one of the things I really like about ModelPort is the ability to be able to interactively edit the dimensions. So rather than having to go to the properties, find the dimensions, figure out where that is, figure out how to resize it, instead what we've done recently is we've actually made these dimensions interactive. So anything that's blue, as you can kind of see in the middle here, I can edit. So for example, obviously, if you look at these dimensions, that's 30 inches for the width of that light, a little bit big. So we want to change that. And so we're actually going to go, actually, I think it's 30 feet, really big. So we want to click on that, right, and change that from 30 feet down to 1 foot, 2 inches. Make that a little bit smaller. And then I click my fit window, and it's going to zoom right back to that. And we see now it shows a 1'2" width and a 1 foot 1.5" height and a 6 foot or 6.5 inch depth. And again, that's what really nice about that. It's just very easy for us and for you to go and edit this. And here's a Lego man. So you're probably asking, now, why are we looking at a Lego man? It's a great example of how to show you how you can actually transform elements within ModelPort. So, for example, oftentimes in ArchiCAD, you open an object up and it has parameters. So a parameter to rotate or move elements within an object. And that's because someone's gone in and they've actually, using GDL, they've programmed in the ability for you to be able to do that, which is really great. But not everybody's going to go and create objects and go through GDL scripting and learn all that stuff to be able to edit that. Here's how you can do it with an imported object. So in the case of this Lego man, I want to take that one of his legs and I want to rotate it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select that leg. I'm now going to go down to the transform panel and I'm going to take the Z and I'm going to move it forward. And then I'm going to take the rotation and I'm going to rotate it and I'm going to rotate it backwards. So now that leg, which before was just straight, is now rotated. So this very simple exercise, what we're trying to show you is the ability to use ModelPort not just to change materials or change pin weights, as I'll show you in a second, but also the ability to even transform elements within it as if you'd had parameters set. But this can be done for anything. Now, how do you edit an element in ModelPort once it's created? Well, you place it into the floor plan. Then once it's placed and you select it, it will appear with a little palette. This is what we call the ModelPort palette. And in that ModelPort palette, you're going to see an MP button. And you'll see the small version of it there and the bigger version right next to the arrow. If we click that MP button, it opens ModelPort. And at this point, we can begin to edit the object. We can view the object, the preview, etc. There's also a second way that we can edit that or activate ModelPort as well. If you go into the object settings dialog within ArchiCAD and you select the object, if it's a ModelPort object, then in the ModelPort panel, the Open in ModelPort Editor button will be enabled. And if you click that, that will also open the ModelPort Editor. So let's talk next a little bit about how you can improve both 2D and 3D graphics. So you remember earlier we talked a little bit about this figure cabinet and the fact that what ModelPort does when it imports it in is it creates and cleans up this 2D plan view, right? So SketchUp and DA object, these are examples of importing directly in by ArchiCAD process, and the ModelPort on the right is the example imported directly into ModelPort. Of course, that's both for 2D and also within the 3D window as well. We can see, obviously, ModelPort is a lot cleaner here on the right. But once we've imported that object, we want to be able to do more than just use it, well, we might just use it the way it comes in, but we give you the ability to be able to edit that, that information as well. So, for example, I could set my pin color and my line weights for this for the 2D symbol and the 3D model by using some of my properties here in ModelPort. So let's see how we do that. So if we select the actual stove, we can set the outside of it as black. And then we can actually set the next elements, the burners, as a red color. And then we can actually set the knobs to be a blue color. And so by setting those and now updating my object, you can see it now has different variations of pin weights and pin colors. And this is really important for both your floor plan view, for elevations, and also for your 3D view as well. Now, it's also critical that we have tools to be able to change and edit our textures and our colors of materials. This particular piece of furniture is a little black, a little dark, and so maybe we want to change that. So we can actually add a texture to that. So we select it, and then we right-click. We can select Add Texture, and we can change it to a different marble texture. Maybe that's still a little too dark, so we'll go ahead and select it again, change it to a different type of marble material, and that's a little lighter. Now we could also select the legs and structure of it, and we use the ArchiCAD materials instead Here we can go to our ArchiCAD materials, and we can select those materials and have those change. So very quickly, we're able to go in and start to be able to change and to work with our materials to be able to update these objects. And again, what's nice here is that the textures, we don't have to, go through a lot of hoops to get those textures just by right-clicking on a material, selecting a texture. Really, really easy to change that. Now, another element that's often a problem when you bring in objects from different sources is it depends on how the author had set up the light. And even he set up the light perfectly in his program, in SketchUp, or in some other program, it may be that that light and the way that it uses transparency and ambient, diffuse light, etc., might not work exactly in ArchiCAD the same way. So this is a good example where this couch, the cushions here, the front, you can see a little too shiny. There's a little too much light hitting it in the way that they're set. And so we can actually go into that. We can actually go down to the diffuse options right here under properties. And we can change those diffuse options like 80 to 30 for specular, shininess. We can bump that maybe to 100. And you can begin to see how it begins to alter and make our materials for this cushion look a lot better. And then we can also, if we want to, we can change that to a fabric upholstery using our ArchiCAD materials. So it gives us that flexibility to be able to change these materials, not just the texture or color, but also much more customized in terms of the properties of that material. Now, this is a really good example of issues we see more and more these days with manufacturers and also just with other types of online libraries where they're not paying attention to how they're posting the objects. So Viking's a good example. They have really amazing detailed models for their objects that you can download. So if you go to their website and you go in and search for all the CAD objects, you can download these objects. They were originally created in Rhino. And then the problem is that they were created in Rhino, and then they simply saved the Rhino file out as different formats, such as the SketchUp format, the Revit format, the 3ds Max, and Wavefront. And that's great because you get this really nice detailed element. The problem is that most of this you really don't need. You need the front of that oven, but you do not need the back half of that oven. And this is a big file. This is a 33.7 megabyte file, 177,000 polygons. I mean, this is the type of object that could slow down, particularly if you have a bunch of them, could slow down the performance of your model. So I'm going to talk about how we can take ModelPort and actually adjust this. So the first thing you'd want to do, of course, is to merge the file, right? You would go to your ArchiCAD, go to File, you go to Interoperability, Merge, and Merge File. And you might be asking, why am I going to do it this way versus bring it into ModelPort? Well, you could bring it into ModelPort, but I'm going to show you this way because what I want to do is I want to bring it first into ArchiCAD. I want to turn it into a morph. I want to delete part of that morph, and then I want to add on a slab to another part as part of an edit, a way of showing you how you can edit an object and then bring it back into ModelPort afterwards. So, and the other thing I want to show you here is that when we go to merge that file and this dialog comes up, we've got two files in here. The first file is the one that we're gonna use as the example here. That's the oven. But see the one below it? That's the stove. The stove is 149 megabytes. I mean, the oven's big enough. That's 33 megabytes. But the stove is 149 megabytes. That's huge. And if you can imagine, if you had, in a project, a bunch of these types of objects you downloaded from Viking and other sources that are just big, it can really start to create performance problems. And that's what we're trying to solve here. So what we're going to do, we're going to merge that in as using a SketchUp option. We're going to place that into our project. And you can see here, when we place it in, that, it's pretty detailed. So we select it. We're going to convert it to a morph. It's going to give us warnings. And yes, it's a large file. We might want to do it outside our project first and then bring it into our project to make sure it's all working good. But this is where we can convert it into a morph so we can edit it. So once it's converted to morph, I can delete the back half of that oven. And now that I've done that, I can draw and I can place a slab there, just a simple slab. The back half of that oven was a huge part of our polygon count in this particular object. Now I can use the import from ArchiCAD option. And when I use that, it'll actually bring that into ArchiCAD. I'm sorry, bring that into ModelPort. So it's gonna bring the slab and all the morph elements into ModelPort. And at this point, I could edit the back half if I wanted to in terms of color. I could edit the knobs or the panels of the oven there, the glass of the oven in terms of materials, all inside ModelPort. But now what I've done is I've combined the original object, the SketchUp object, we convert it into a morph. I combined the front part of that with a slab in the back, and that's going to reduce this polygon count dramatically. So in essence, what that's doing, after going through some steps here, and even some polygon reduction steps, which I'll show you in a second, you could actually take this object that originally was much larger and reduce it down. In this case, it was reduced down by file size by 94%, and in terms of polygons by 89%. And then of course we did some graphic editing. You can kind of see up here on the far right in the floor plan view where we edited the line types and line weights, as well as added a fill for the oven as well. And this is the kind of things we can do to start to customize this to something that's going to be much more valuable for us, and it's going to perform much better in the model. And then I want to conclude by talking a little more in depth about how to manage these imported models. And I alluded to a little bit there in terms of our Viking oven. And I showed you some components of that in terms of how you might manage that in terms of editing that morph, replacing it with a slab, etc. But also within ModelPort, we have the ability to be able to change the polygon count. So as I mentioned earlier, polygons are the things that can be really impact your performance. A tree is a good example. Trees have lots of polygons because you have lots of leaves. Those leaves make up a lot of polygons, particularly if they're a higher definition type tree. So in this case, you can see it's this one tree here. Actually, it's pretty large. It's over 1 million polygons. And you can see how high this red bar on the right here is. It's maximum limit. Nice thing is that I can actually go and I can reduce this polygon count down. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to select the model, and then below here under the detail level, I'm going to change it to poly reduce. And now I can change the decimation steps down or up, not set it to by default. But now I've reduced that down to 18% of what it was before. So that's 82% reduction in the polygons here. I could take that a step further and probably reduce it down even further with the decimation steps. And again, this is going to vary depending upon the type of object you're using, okay, or I should say that you're managing. Because some objects, if I reduce it down by a large amount, you're going to see those models maybe degrade a little bit quality-wise. Others, like a tree or something else, you may not see that kind of degradation in the model because it's more organic. Right? So it's just going to vary. But the nice thing here is it gives you this management tool, and that's what you're looking for with a lot of these types of objects that have a high polygon counts. Now, in addition to managing the polygons, we also want to manage the file size. As I mentioned with that Viking oven a second ago, I mean, there's two files there, right? One was 33 megabytes, the other was almost 150 megabytes. That's a large file size. And if you put a bunch of those objects inside your model file in ArchiCAD, your model file of ArchiCAD is going to bloat up significantly. And I've seen this happen before where people bring in objects from all over the place. They go into their embedded library, and then they're wondering why their model file in ArchiCAD is 800 megabytes or a million or whatever. It's a gigabyte. It's a huge file, right? And while ArchiCAD can handle the large file size pretty well, you really want to keep it down. You don't want to get it that big. You want to manage that performance side. So what we've done in ModelPort is we've created a ModelPort format that helps compress the object file size down as much as 8 times smaller. And if you look over here in the properties, we have the ModelPort format, the GDL format, and the GDL with ModelPort. The basic difference between these is the ModelPort format is our internal proprietary format. The GDL format is the standard format that is in all ArchiCAD objects that's created in ArchiCAD. And then the GDL with ModelPort is kind of a combination of the two. And so if we select the GDL format to begin with here, and we update this particular object, and then we go to the file menu and we open up the library manager, we're going to see the size of this file. So this chair, which we looked at earlier, right, earlier in the presentation, is 13 megabytes in size. Okay, if it's just a standard GDL object that you would typically use and import and work with an ArchiCAD. However, if we now change that to a ModelPort format, and we update that object again, and we go back and we open up that library manager one more time, we're going to see it's now 2.2 megabytes. And this is what I'm getting at with our format, is that it maintains all this powerful stuff that we're able to do with this object in terms of being able to edit it and manage the polygon counts and and further editing options. But it also helps us to reduce the file size, and that's really significant because you really want to keep the file size down on these objects. Otherwise, it's going to bloat your ArchiCAD file as well. Now, recently in our recent update of ArchiCAD this last summer, we actually added a couple of different features that are very important here when you're bringing in a bunch of objects externally. So if you're in SketchUp, the 3D warehouse, you've downloaded a bunch of objects from the 3D warehouse. One of the things you're going to want to do is to be able to perhaps edit multiple scenes here. What that means is, let's say, for example, I went to 3D warehouse, or I went to a manufacturer, and I downloaded a bunch of these lights from this lighting company. And I want to be able to view them before I bring them into ArchiCAD. I don't want to have to bring in 20 objects and then figure out what I want, delete half of them. I want to view which ones I want first, and then create the objects afterwards. And so what we enabled now is the ability to be able to view individual objects within the same ModelPort. So you don't have to close one object, open the next one, and close the object and open the next one. Now in ModelPort, we can view multiple objects all at the same time. That really, particularly in the front end when you're trying to preview a lot of objects, really helps to kind of quickly go through the objects and decide which ones you want and which ones you don't. The other thing we did is we enabled batch import. This is really important too, because if you've gone, again, to a manufacturer, the 3D warehouse, or other sources, you've downloaded a bunch of objects, it takes a lot of time to import each object in individually. In this case, you can basically do the batch import. Select, however many objects you want, tell it to convert and import into ModelPort and ArchiCAD, and that will then automatically bring those into your object settings. And as you can see here, under the embedded library, it brings those all in. And then you can simply go open up your object settings, select the object you want to view, click the Open in ModelPort Editor, and we'll directly open up ModelPort, that object into ModelPort where you can begin to edit and preview that object. And finally, how can you demo and get started with ModelPort for those of you who are interested in it? Here's what you would do. Go to archvista.com/ModelPort. And on that web page, you're going to see an option there to select Download Trial. And simply enter in your email, and it'll take you to a page to download the trial. Once the trial is downloaded, just go through the process of installation. Basically, the ModelPort folder just goes right into your add-ons folder inside of ArchiCAD. We do support ArchiCAD 26 as well back to ArchiCAD 21. So a lot of versions in there that we do support. And you should be able to find a lot of also answers to a lot of your questions here about ModelPort features, comparison chart, etc. Is all there to help you as well. So with that, I know I've covered a lot today. I appreciate everybody kind of attending the webinar. If you have questions, go ahead and enter those into the control panel. If you've already entered those in, I'll go ahead and take those questions in just a second. Also, if you, again, want to purchase ModelPort, just go to archifist.com/ModelPort and you can purchase it there. If you've got questions, do feel free to email us there at info@archifist.com. And then, of course, there's our phone number as well. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at the questions and get started with our Q&A.